Hello, boys and girls. It is November, so what holiday is coming? Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is later this week. So today we're going to listen to the story Balloons Over Broadway, which is the true story of the puppeteer of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Have you ever watched the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade on TV? You have? Well, then you have already seen part of our story. This is the story about Tony Sarge, who was the man who created all of the balloons for the parade. So it's a true story. So it's a biography because it's about a person. And this story was written and illustrated by Melissa Sweet. So we're going to listen to our story, and I want you to be thinking about some balloons that you've seen in the parade as we listen. From the time he was a little boy, Tony Sarge loved to figure out how to make things move. He once said he became a marionette man when he was only 6 years old. A marionette is an old style of puppet that there's strings that go up to the puppet and there's little handles, and that's how you control the puppet. His father had asked him to feed the chickens at 6:30 in the morning every day. Tony had an idea. What if he could feed the chickens without leaving his bed? Do you think he's going to figure out a way to do that? I don't know. He rigged up some pulleys and ran rope from the chicken coop door to his bedroom window. That night, he spread chicken feed outside the chicken coop door. I wonder why he did that. So in this picture, it shows you 1, spread feed the night before. 2, pull rope. 3, door opens. And 4, chickens come out to get their feed. Wonder if it'll work. The next morning, the clock says 6:30. Tony pulled on the rope, and the door to the chicken coop opened. The chickens ate their breakfast. Tony stayed snug in his bed, and his dad, so impressed, never made Tony do another chore. When Tony grew up, he moved to London, which is in England, where he discovered that no one was making marionettes for kids anymore. Remember, marionettes are those old type of puppets. So out of wood, cloth, and strings, Tony began to make puppets. He figured out ways to make his marionettes' movement so lifelike they performed as if they were real actors. Word soon spread about Tony's amazing marionettes. When Tony moved to New York City, the Tony Sarge marionettes began performing on Broadway, which Broadway is a really famous place in New York City where lots of people go and perform, and they do all sorts of plays. So the marionettes were on Broadway. In the heart of New York City, in Herald Square, was the biggest show on earth, R.H. Macy's department store. Macy's had heard about Tony's puppets and asked him, him to design a puppet parade for the store's holiday windows. So Tony made new puppets based on storybook characters, then attached them to gears and pulleys to make them move. So when this was happening, the people couldn't shop on the internet. The internet wasn't a thing. So people went shopping at stores and they walked around and saw a lot of windows that would have these huge displays of really pretty things and just really cool decorations, especially at the holidays. And so they wanted him to design their window. Macy's Wonder Town. So they're all of his marionettes. In Macy's Wonder Town windows, Tony's mechanical marionettes danced across the stage as if by magic. All day long, they performed to shoppers, jostling for a better look. But Macy's had an even bigger job in store for Tony. Many of the people working at Macy's were immigrants, and as the holidays approached, they missed their own holiday traditions of music and dancing in the streets. So immigrants are people who come to the United States from other countries. So they missed the things that they did in their countries to celebrate holidays. Macy's agreed to put on a parade for their employees, and they hired Tony to help. Tony was an immigrant, so he loved the idea of creating a parade based on street carnivals from all over the world. He made costumes and built horse-drawn floats, and Macy's even arranged to bring in bears, elephants, and camels from Central Park Zoo. Sounds like a big parade. The animals joined hundreds of Macy's employees on Thanksgiving Day, 1924, winding their way from Harlem to Herald Square. It was a dazzling parade. In fact, Macy's first parade was such a success that they decided to have one every year on Thanksgiving Day to celebrate America's own holiday. So you can see there's a juggler, there's the marionettes that Tony created, there's some floats coming down, and then if you look down here, you can see the elephants and the animals from the Central Park Zoo. Each year, the parade grew, but when Macy's brought in lions and tigers, in addition to the bears, elephants, and camels, the animals roared and growled and frightened the children. That's not good. We don't want to scare kids on Thanksgiving. Tony, can you think of something spectacular? It's calling Tony again. Macy's asked Tony to replace the animals. I wonder what he's going to make. Tony hoped to replace the animals with some kind of puppets, but his marionettes were less than 3 feet tall, so that would have been too small. He would have to make much larger puppets in order for them to be seen in the parade. And how could he make them strong enough to hold up in bad weather, yet light enough to move up and down the streets? So they had to be strong. So if it was raining or snowing, it snows a lot in New York, or if there was ice, if it was sleeting, they needed to be strong, but they also needed to be light so people could move them. Tony knew of a company in Ohio that made blimps out of rubber, the perfect material for any weather. When he called the company and showed them his sketches, they agreed to make what Tony wanted. Still, how would Tony make the big puppets move? A blimp is constructed using simple shapes that are glued together. So here's a blimp, and it's using simple shapes. And so here was one that they made. They made a caterpillar. Then Tony had an idea. from an Indonesian rod puppet in his collection. So remember, he had a big collection of puppets. So he had a puppet that looked like this from Indonesia, and it moved with rods from the bottom of the puppet instead of the marionettes like over here that have strings that are controlled from the top. So I wonder what he's going to do. On Thanksgiving Day, Tony's creatures, some as high as 16 feet, spilled into the streets, and the crowds cheered wildly. Part puppet, part balloon, the air-filled rubber bags wobbled down the avenues, propped up by wooden sticks. But now the sidewalks were so packed with people that only those in the first few rows could really see the parade. Tony realized that his puppets would have to be even bigger and higher off the ground. And though the sticks helped to see the puppets, they were stiff and heavy. Tony wanted his balloons to articulate, to move and gesture, move like puppets. But how? With a marionette, the controls are above and the puppet hangs down. So the puppet's low and the controls are up. And if you're doing that in like this elephant is a marionette. So if you're doing that with a balloon, you can't really do that because how are you going to move it down the street? I wonder what he's going to do. But what if the controls were below and the puppet could rise up? So look, now he has his elephant and he has the strings below the puppet. So let's see what they're going to do. During the next year, Tony set his new idea into motion. This time, he asked the company in Ohio to make balloons out of rubberized silk, as strong as rubber, but lighter than rubber alone. Most important, Tony ordered the balloons to be filled not just with air, but with helium too. Since helium is lighter than air, it would make the balloons rise. Once the puppets were completed, they were deflated and shipped back to Tony in New York. Tony did not know if everything would go as planned. What if the balloons are filled with too much helium? What if one hits a sharp object? Will they fit under the EL, which was they have a train system in New York, the elevated train track. That's what EL stood for. It was still dark on Thanksgiving morning when Tony filled the balloons with helium, tethering them down with sandbags. So he was holding them down. Because remember, now that they're filled with helium, they're going to float high up in the air. But by 1 p.m., the sidewalks were packed with people ready for the parade. Then, one by one, Tony cut the lines to the sandbags. And the magnificent upside-down marionettes rose up to the skies. How cool is that? You see them? You see that elephant floating high up in the air? Nodding and waving to the crowds below, they sailed past Central Park. They sailed down Broadway. High above the crowds, they flounced in the afternoon wind, pulling the rope handlers this way and that. Yet with every heave-ho, the balloons gestured and articulated like wild puppets, and the crowd screamed for more. After the balloons were eased under the EL, they ended in front of Macy's at Tony's Wonder Town windows. And from that day on, every Thanksgiving morning, crowds have lined the sidewalks of New York City to see what new balloons would rise to the skies for Macy's famous parade. Tony Sarge, the puppeteer who loved to figure out how to make things move, had set the stage with a little rigging for a puppet to be anything anyone could imagine it to be. And boys and girls, that is the story of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So when you're watching the parade this year, think about that. Somebody almost 100 years ago figured out how to make those balloons fly. The first parade was in 1924. So the first year he had the balloons was 1925, and those were the balloons that were low. So then this parade was in 1926. So it's been 94 years since the first balloons flew way up high at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So that's a pretty cool story. You're going to work on a project for us this week to design your own Macy's Thanksgiving Day balloon or float. So we will explain that on the next couple slides. But I hope you enjoyed our story, and I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving if you're listening to my story.